Hello and welcome back to GI Live Online. I'm Chris, I run GamesIndustry.biz, and we've got a slightly different session for you right now. During this week, you're going to hear a lot about making your games more successful, publishing, and how to be more successful with your games and studios. But there is another rapidly growing area of the business that might be of interest to you. And that comes in the physical space, both in terms of games merchandise, but also physical versions of your titles. Contrary to popular belief, it is not just the domain of the big AAA giants. To talk us a bit about that, we've got one of the geniuses behind I Am 8-Bit, Jon. So hello, Jon. Welcome to the show.
Hello. I was incredibly nervous to do this interview because I haven't had a haircut in over a year.
Let's not talk about haircuts.
As long as we're not talking about hair, I can answer all your other questions.
I'm thinking of putting like a warning alert before the videos just to say, apologies in advance for haircuts. But yeah. For those who perhaps don't know I Am 8-Bit and what you do, why don't you tell us about how you built the business? Because it sort of has an interesting journey, right?
It certainly does. It's one of those stories that it almost doesn't make sense until it makes sense, because we followed this path that you can't really design and learn a lot of stuff along the way. We're 16 years old this year, being 2021. And when we started, we were definitely not doing most of the things that we're doing now. But the through line is pretty obvious. I Am 8-Bit began in 2005 as an art show. It was the world's first pop culture themed art show, and the theme being video games. I was just a animation writer working for like Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, Disney Channel at the time. Previous to that, I was a video game journalist, writing for magazines when those things existed. The paper with printing on it and screenshots that were of terrible resolution. And I knew a lot of artists through animation, and I knew a lot about games and the game industry through, my previous life as a journalist. And just saw those two things colliding in the context that people loved games, and artists, especially on like Post-it pads and around the studios, would just doodle and, love things like Mario and Donkey Kong and Zelda and Sonic. And you would just see the culture permeating in this way that was really beautiful. That wasn't really celebrated. Like all you would see is posters in Nintendo Power. And that's about as far as video game art went in terms of what you could put on your wall. So I thought what a novel concept it would be to give all these young artists who love games a showcase, a medium in which to share that with the world versus just disposing of them on Post-it pads and making it just studio fodder that no one else could see. That grew into something that was very unexpected, but also an analog for everything that we do at I Am 8-Bit. We did several more I Am 8-Bit art shows. And you'll see in our merchandise, from vinyl records to physical games to anything else we do, that very artistic slant, that interpretation. Because for us, it's important to celebrate universes, and the very notion of merchandise and putting things out into the world should, from our perspective, contribute and expand mythology versus just carbon copying and replicating it. Along the way, as the I Am 8-Bit art show brand grew, I met my business partner, Amanda White, who is not on this call, but I will talk about her like she is. She came from film production. She was making movies and TV shows. And when we met, we were coming from very different worlds, but we had a common language in appreciating artistic things, be it visuals in paintings and graphic design, be it music, be it video games. Our interests were very varied, but in the middle, you had this kind of creative explosion. When we put our heads together, we came up with really good ideas, and it, apply her business acumen and the things that I do well. And we had a business that made sense to us, but it wasn't really something that the world had yet. And I can get into all the various trappings, but at the end of the day, iam8bit's always just been this very nimble, flexible creature that is very much positioned in evolution. Like we're always trying to do new things, and our MO at the end of the day is, if we're getting bored, that means we're becoming complacent, and we should veer off that course and try something new. So every touch point in the business has been driven by the factor that, like, me and Amanda are very much curious people, but also people that are easily stifled by just cookie cutter approaches to things. So we're always trying to make things personal and specific and nuanced. And to us, that brings a flavor that's the identity of iam8bit.
And this is the thing is that you sort of known now for your things like the vinyls and things like that, but you sort of just stumbled upon this sort of by accident, right? You sort of were, is it that you saw people were selling your PR merchandise online for quite a lot of money? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the first evolution of the company from art show was Nintendo, PlayStation, Capcom, all of these companies coming to us to recruit us for press kits and mailers and little things here and there, because they saw our ability to, quote unquote, tap into that authentic quality. And for us, that's just being a fan of the thing and seeing that there's unique and wonderful languages and opportunities in different worlds. And if you take the time to speak that language fluently as a fan, you can do so many cooler things than just working off of key art and playing in kind of the standard style guide universe of things. So as we started doing these press kits, and then those grew into community events, of which one of our first was Street Fighter Club. But then we started doing a lot of stuff for Bethesda. We did Wolfenstein and Dishonored and a lot of other cool events. We followed this practice of wanting to give fans something on their way out, that concert T-shirt that you get after you've seen a band that you really love. What is the equivalent of that for a video game event for the community? So we would just always make tchotchkes. We would make swag that you would just get because you showed up. We weren't selling it. We were just giving it to you as part of the budget for the event. Same with mailers and the press kits we would send out. Like, no one was buying those. Those were clearly just created for the promotion of this particular game. But what started happening was people would sell those on eBay for a lot of money. It was like almost shocking when we would get emails and people would point that out. And initially, we had a few publishers and partners that would be like, we need to take these down. And it's like, well, you can't stop people from selling things like that they acquired fair and square. Like there's an economy for it. And that's really interesting. That's in fact bolstering your stock in a lot of ways too. So you should just leave it alone. Don't issue takedown notices. That's crazy. But for us, we were noticing that the things we were making were also categories that didn't exist in merchandise. Before we really got into the racket, you would see apparel, you would see plushies, you would see some basics, but the stuff we were making was really highly customized in particular. And it's stuff that you couldn't normally sell in a global retail marketplace because it was too specific in a way. One instance was for Wolfenstein, when Bethesda bought id. That was one of their first games out of the gate from the studio. Wonderful game, tons of legacy. But what Bethesda did with reviving it was a lot of really clever things, including hijacking the idea of 1960s American pop music and re-recording things like House of the Rising Sun and all these like really epic, iconic songs in German. And they were using them in trailers and advertising, and you can hear them in the background when you play the game. But we're like, well, what if we did a period authentic release of these songs on records, on 45s, but didn't put any Bethesda branding or iam8bit branding or anything of the sort, and made them feel of the era. And so we made 3 of those. We gave them away at the door. You would randomly get one of the 3 versions. You were not guaranteed all 3. And those things were selling like crazy and being traded on the aftermarket. And we did a couple other releases along the way. Our very first was Tron Evolution for the video game in response to the Tron Legacy movie coming out. And that we only made a few hundred of as a mailer. And it sold for upwards of like $1,000 or $1,200 on the aftermarket for a single LP. And so you look at those 2 examples and you start to realize like, wow, like people want video game soundtracks on wax. So we just started approaching companies to license video game soundtracks, and we were laughed out of the room on so many occasions. And then after a lot of conversations of convincing people that like this could be worthwhile, a few companies took a shot on us, primarily Devolver with Hotline Miami 2, PlayStation with Journey, and a few other choice releases. Rare were amongst some of our first. And then we started proving it out and proving there was a market for those kinds of things. But previous to that, there simply wasn't. You would see independent composers releasing vinyl, but at the end of the day, it just wasn't something that anyone really thought of as a place to make money. And that's the hardest thing with licensing. If you're doing official merch, you have to fill out these forms that project what could happen in success. And, like we're basically saying we'll sell 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 more of these things. And you're paying sometimes advances, or you're guaranteeing that a certain amount of revenue will come in. But from our reality, like we couldn't do any of that because we just didn't know. We had a hunch that it would work. And oftentimes that's the fun of entering the marketplace with something new and wacky. Same thing with physical games. Like is so many signs pointed to physical games being on the outs. But we took the approach of, this premium collectible idea of physical media, plus also understanding that some people don't download games still. Actually, a vast majority of people don't download games still. And there is a incredibly large bucket to service that isn't just the people that have insane broadband. Like we have to think about like not everyone lives in New York and Los Angeles and these giant metropolises that have 1 gig up down.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I analyze the market as part of my job at GamesIndustry.biz, and a lot of people talk about the digital switch, and the digital market share is increasing dramatically, particularly over the pandemic year. But actually, physical game sales in most major markets increased last year. And their share of the market got smaller. But it's still a multi-billion-dollar industry, physical games. It's not like saying, it's all digital now. It's really not. It's not even nearly. It's huge. You don't just cut that off. You can't really. It would be massively damaging to the games business. So you're right. In that, we can sort of ignore. It's there. There's an audience there, and that audience loves this stuff. I mean, I love this stuff. I've got it around me. I mean, you've been doing this a while now, but what have been sort of your standout successes? What's worked for you?
A lot of things, but it is that evolution in a way. One of the more recent successes we've had is Ori and the Will of the Wisps in brokering a partnership with Microsoft and Moon Studios to be the publisher both digitally and physically on Switch. It was a nice milestone for all of us. And we'd worked with Moon for many years on the Ori vinyl soundtrack for Blind Forest. When Wisp was coming out, we already had the license for that. But when we started talking about what this could look like, it presented a lot of different opportunities for kind of leveraging all the things that we learned up until that point. So you look at like the art show, for instance, everything we do in vinyl applies to like what we were doing in those art shows starting 16 years ago, where we commission artists to interpret worlds and brands. So, the Ori vinyl is artists representing their vision of Ori in celebration of something that they love. You look at community events that we've done for like Capcom, Bethesda, Nintendo, all these companies. And all of that was about putting people into the world, like, dosing them into this kind of surreality in a way, if only for a couple hours or an evening. And what we tried to start capturing, especially with that Ori Collector's Edition, was how do we bring that experience into someone's home and into someone's life in a more permanent way, especially since, in the state of pandemic, you can't go and do things. And it really started changing our perspective or evolving our perspective on how we approach products and how meaningful they can be to someone if you do them right. And so that's where you get the transforming box, the stained glass art piece. It's not junk, quote unquote. It's not stuff that you're just going to toss in the garbage or is going to get lost in a drawer. It's stuff you're going to proudly display as part of your life. And it's beautiful things that even the box itself is something that looks nice and can be used and shown off in a way that you can be proud of this thing you love as part of this community of Ori. In physical games, we do a lot of that, and we've done cartridges for Super Nintendo and Nintendo. In Celebration, we've done modern consoles. But one of the things that we see as an opportunity in direct-to-consumer sales versus retail is retail. You have to be more on the nose. You have to kind of explain what the product is to the customer, because it might be their first time discovering it on that shelf. Whereas direct-to-consumer is an opportunity to speak the secret language, if you will. You don't have to be so on the nose, one-to-one. You can create different aesthetics for the cover sheets and the packaging that doesn't have to have a verbose product description of all the gameplay features, because the customer you're capturing is already a fan of the thing. So you don't have to like overdo it with explanation. You take all of those things and you look at Ori, and it kind of draws on that 16 years of experience all in like a singular box or like a vinyl soundtrack. And for us, that's, not only a financial success in terms of sales, because we also took Ori to retail with our buddies at Skybound and have sold a crazy amount of units to people who normally wouldn't be discovering Ori if they had to download it. Like it's about spreading that love in a way that's, often ignored. The power of retail is much more about, grabbing people where they buy games and consume media and exposing them to things that they otherwise wouldn't discover at all. And then direct to consumer is about celebrating for the fan this beautiful opportunity to give them something really special that is meaningful to their life. Someone who's played 2 games for hours and hours and hours in the Ori universe, they have an emotional connection to that game. And it's our duty to give them something really special. So for us, I would say the most recent success is kind of taking all of our experience and putting it into that kind of ensemble, if you will. We're really proud of it. Moon and Microsoft and everyone. It was historic in a lot of ways.
Amazing. I'm like, because I can understand where you're coming from, because growing up, I was a big fan of rare video games, just not uncommon video games from the developer Rare. So things like your Perfect Dark thing with the cheese necklace and all this kind of stuff. It means something to me which wouldn't mean to anyone else unless you play Perfect Dark and know that game intimately. You wouldn't understand why there's a piece of cheese on the front of that vinyl, and it's whereas I do. So it feels like they made that for me rather than anyone just stumbling across it, even though I think it does look quite stylish. But I'm sort of going off there a little bit.
Well, I mean, to the point of like the things that are meaningful to you personally versus like if your parents or your siblings or whoever walked into the room and saw that Perfect Dark vinyl, if they didn't have that same experience, it would just be like a vinyl. But when you look at packaging and you look at really good design and the stuff that really excites us is the nuances. Unfortunately, paying attention to nuances and details and hiding little Easter eggs and, wink, wink, nod, nods, takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
It's a lot of hard work to really land on those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I think at least for us, that's what makes I Am 8-Bit releases special, is that we take that time. It's not recommended because it limits your ability to focus on things, and you can only put out so many releases. So when you look at us in comparison to our competitors, we would argue that we don't really have competitors in the traditional sense, because we've chosen to focus very specifically on this kind of thing. And we think it's very special to how we approach the world and look at things. It is not the only way to do it, and it is not the best way to do it always, depending on what you're looking for. And I think that's important to talk about when you're talking about merchandise and what's out there and available. Is our way is one way of doing it, and there's a vast other approaches out there that are interesting and cool too. It just depends what you want in your life.
How is this site? How is this physical space then? Physical stuff, and I'm not just talking vinyls, but physical products or anything else you've done. How has it grown for you over the years? I take it it's got. You taught one of your biggest successes, one of your most recent releases. So I'm guessing it's getting bigger and bigger every time. But how has it grown?
We've been lucky enough through the years that growth has always occurred, and you could say that that's like categories opening up. We do physical games, we do vinyl, we do other merchandise. We do art prints and shows, and there's a lot of different categories we play in. And from our first vinyl release to now, just the market in general has grown. From our first physical games release to now, the market and awareness has just grown tremendously. So it's all on an upswing, and it continues to be. But if we're talking numbers, because that's the more interesting stuff, even just direct to consumer, for 2020 from 2019, we grew like 300% in sales overall, which is kind of crazy to say, because you don't even realize it's happening, because at the end of the day, you're still doing what you're doing. You're just doing more volume of the things that you're doing. So it's when you look back at those analytics, you're like, wow, that's really cool. But it doesn't really change our perspective. It perhaps opens a few doors in terms of the kind of things we can manufacture, because it's less niche in the sense that if you're only making 500 or 1,000 of something, it's harder to do certain kinds of things. But if you're making 5,000, 10,000 of something, plus it opens up your manufacturing abilities a little bit. And then when you look at the global retail landscape, it's in the last couple of years, we've dove in headfirst to try to kind of explore what that looks like. So in the case of Untitled Goose Game, for instance, we have our direct consumer releases, which are like our eco-friendly packaging, trying to innovate that space. But the limitations of eco packaging are that the supply chains suck. It's incredibly expensive to do eco things right now, because if you're going to do them in a global landscape, the materials don't exist in all the places they need to. And you would have to ship all of those materials into different markets. And in effect, you're actually wasting more energy and polluting more by doing that. So when you see, you ask why people haven't done eco packaging in a broader way, and that's why. And it's something we're trying to change. But we took advantage of that scenario to try to prove out this would be really cool as a test model, Untitled Goose Game direct to consumer eco packaging. But also, Goose Game was very zeitgeisty. It was clearly a phenomenon. Kids were dressing like geese for Halloween, which, when you get Halloween costumes, you've got a hit on your hands. So we partnered with our friends at Skybound to go more mass retail globally. We saw the potential, and so did House and Panic. And if we look at Goose Game, and we look at Pathless, and we look at Ori, and the things we did in retail in 2020 versus 2019, we grew 2,300%. And that just shows you that physical is not just like this thing that is a dying breed, but in fact is a burgeoning thing. And even retail, from that perspective, like a lot of people thought it was going to die in the last couple of years. Retail is not going anywhere because people shop where they shop, and not everyone buys from Amazon. Not everyone goes to GameStop. Not everyone, like, you're buying your stuff wherever you might be in the world, and that store is your go-to, and that's where you're picking up stuff. And that's not just like singular in approach. That's toilet paper, that's groceries, that's everything. So you got to think about like all that thing in a global landscape, and not just the stores that if you play all those regions and you play all those countries and get games into those places, you can do tremendous numbers, and you can share games with a lot more people. It's hard. It's not easy to go into all of those countries and localize and do that. It's a lot of fucking work, but at the end of the day, sorry for swearing, but it is a lot of work. At the end of the day, it's valuable because, games do make people happy, and people want to discover games, but you need to get the games in front of them for them to discover too. That's half the battle.
Mm-hmm. Wow. There's actually an independent games retailer in my town, just 5 doors down from me. Well,
and if you look at all the independent game retailers across the world, and then you look at all the chain stores like the Targets and the Best Buys and the Amazons and anything, like I can name you 1,000 different retailers depending on what country you live in. If you add them all up, even if all of them are just buying 5 or 10 or 20 or 100 units, it's a lot of stores. And the same thing goes for vinyl records. It's like boutiques, little local shops do make a big difference if each of them are buying a couple copies of something, and that proliferates. To help you kind of like understand the landscape of what direct to consumer versus what retail can look like. A general release for like a small indie title, you can expect, if there's enough of an audience, like 3,000 to 5,000 units for a typical release. Sometimes more, sometimes less, really depending, but that's your average. For a retail release, you're selling in the hundreds of thousands of copies. So it's dramatic. And if you look at that from a perspective of, revenue to the developer and publisher, like that's tremendously helpful, like to future games and future prospects. And that's just the physical game aspect of it. That's not other merchandise too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, are there certain types of games that work, or perhaps better saying don't work, or genres that don't work or do work in this sort of space? What have you found?
This is by no means scientific. This is this is things that we've noticed through time. But console gamers, from our perspective and from what we've noticed habit-wise, buy the most physical merch. And we think that's because if you're a console gamer, you're typically playing lots and loads of different games. Like you're not just fixated on one game for the year. You're playing a whole bunch of them. So therefore, like your interests are wider. There's a wider swath of things available to you for you to, be interested in or consume. And you're just more prone to in a convention or on Amazon or wherever you might be, like find things that appeal to you just by basis of you just having this more well-rounded perspective. When you look at PC and the economy there, it's much more lifestyle focused because you are typically playing one game, a couple games for a much longer period of time. If you look at like League of Legends, or you look at World of Warcraft, or Overwatch, or any of this stuff, you're playing hundreds of hours. You're not just playing something for 10 hours, beating it and walking away. And you're also investing a lot in your rig and the accessories that go along with it. So you're less prone to consume merchandise from all these different places and hone it into like a singular thing. And your disposable income might be spent on things like accessories too, and not just merchandise for that particular game. So it's a slightly different mindset, but it's still a broad and wide audience. For us, the one thing that we haven't really cracked super well and is difficult is mobile. And the only thing we can really point at is, mobile it's free to play typically, or even in the mobile premium model, it's really inexpensive compared to console or PC. So the consumer habits are different. Like no one's as conditioned to see value in extending the experiential mythology into merchandise. You look at Angry Birds, for instance, and that's one of those rare mobile feats that, extended into plushies that you could buy at 7-Eleven or, other convenience stores. It went really wide. I can't speak to the successes of that merchandise, but, the fact that it went so broadly is interesting, but it's also very rare. Like it's really hard to convert mobile players into people who will actually buy ancillary merchandise. We've worked with brands like Monument Valley, and we've done well by that, but it's not broad. It's a very specialized market that you're funneling into like smaller and smaller funnels at that point. Mobile, 100 million players, 200 million players in mobile doesn't mean you're going to sell, 1 million t-shirts. In fact, it's much harder because there's not really a direct connection to that experience that you play for 5 minutes, 10 minutes to wanting to extend into your life, that same thing.
Yeah, I get that. Well, I'm not surprised, but yeah, it's nicely articulated.
Again, not scientific. It's just stuff we've observed, but it's interesting nonetheless.
Yeah. Because we've got a lot of indies watching this, and they might be considering physical, but I know from my experience watching this play out, the physical products tend to follow quite a long time after the digital release or shortly after digital release or whenever. Is that the right way around of doing it? Should they be thinking about it earlier?
That's a catch-22. Our general thesis on this is you need an audience to sell merchandise. And if you don't have an audience, then there's no one to buy your merch. We've been in multiple scenarios and experimented through the years. Typically, our recommendation is let the game get its sea legs, let it grow an audience digitally, see what the appetite for the audience is, and start slow. Like don't overwhelm, don't make too much stuff all at once. You can phase things and tier things. Like for us, we find that physical games and vinyl are what we call our anchor products. They're the higher price point things, but also the most kind of obvious things that people are seeking when it comes to merchandise from us. It's different with other competitors, but then you can grow from there. It's like you test the waters and you release a physical game, you release a vinyl soundtrack, you see where the audience is and what their appetite is, and then maybe phase 2, phase 3, you can release an art print or a plushie or a t-shirt. But the thing you don't want to do, and this is what we call the in and out menu when we talk about branding and merch. In and out is successful because you don't have a lot of choices. You have a hamburger, you have a cheeseburger, you have a couple flavors of milkshakes, you got fries, and that's basically it. Like you don't really have a lot of customization options outside of that. But you look at McDonald's and they have everything. And it's like the efficiency of In-N-Out is prolific in the fact that they move people really quickly, but they still provide you a quality product. Whereas McDonald's is moving people quickly, but they're not giving you the best food. And if you spread yourself that thin, you have to start making sacrifices. You start choosing materials that aren't the best. You hold inventory that has to serve multiple purposes, and you just start making decisions that probably aren't the best for your fans. And then you also risk taking a bath on some of those things too, because if you have too many choices, what tends to happen is people just won't make any choice at all. They won't buy anything. If you're stuck with all this indecision, you might just end up getting distracted and walk away. So it's better to grow an audience and grow that appetite than it is to overwhelm people right at first. This takes a lot of patience, and the thing that every developer wants to do is make stuff right away because, making stuff is fun and it's cool to have t-shirts and plushies and all those things, but you need people to want to have those and like bring them into their life. And the most important thing to remember is that merchandise can extend the life cycle of a game exponentially. And it's like, you should look at merch as a beat on your marketing calendar, like time and time again. So it's like, there's no such thing anymore as like a game coming out and just dying on the vine. Look at Among Us, and, years later that game got discovered and became a massive hit. And there's so many stories like that where a game comes out and the audience finds that game 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, and explodes. It's not like movies where, you have the theatrical window and your first weekend, the box office goes bust and you're a bomb and you're like labeled a bomb for the rest of existence. Games have this amazing ability to continue to introduce themselves to new audiences and new players. So it's best to remember that you got a lot of years to release stuff and you don't have to do it all up front.
Merchandise, I guess, can be another discovery down the line, right? So, it's these products and it can bring in a new audience and it could be that trigger for more success, I guess. And
I mean, Amanda's son, when he was like 2 or 3, we were in the airport and he wasn't really exposed to mass media yet. He wasn't a kid that was staring at screens all day long. And there was this little girl about his age, like sitting in the terminal, and she was holding a Mickey Mouse doll. And keep in mind, Amanda's son doesn't know who Mickey Mouse is, nor has he been to Disneyland or anything of the sort. But he walked up and snatched the Mickey Mouse doll from this little girl's hands and like ran away with it, merely because he liked the design of it. So there's this other reverse end of merchandise that, so you can like something and not even know where it came from sometimes too. And I think that happens with games. And I think that happens with vinyl records or plushies or anything where, you can hear the theme song to Ori, for instance, and love it and not even know it was from a video game. And like, those are kind of the magical moments of discovery too, where people who self-label themselves as, I'm not a gamer, I don't like video games. We often find that they're exposed to things that we're doing through a friend, and they get into it because they're like, oh, I didn't know video game soundtracks could be good like this. And it's like, that's super insulting to anyone who makes video game music, as if like there's this like specialized core of individuals that specifically try to make the music so nerdy that it only appeals to people who know how to press buttons frenetically. It's like, it's music. And, that's part of the joy for us is, exposing people to all these wondrous things that are just well-designed, beautiful artifacts. And it doesn't even matter that they're from a game most of the time. That's just like almost a bonus. It's one of the things we try to put into our products at the very least is, making sure they're cool to people, even if they don't identify as someone super nerdy that would play video games.
I remember when I was a kid and my best mate, when I told him I was playing this Pokemon game, he went, "Oh, the card game." So, we've all heard of those examples. Well, I mean, I'm conscious of the time. We've spoken for ages, but I've got a couple of questions I want to get through.
Absolutely.
And one of them was physical. Obviously, there's risk involved in physical, and you've touched upon it a little bit in that you have to manufacture these things, distribute these things. There's the costs involved. How do you manage that risk when you're looking at 3,000, 5,000 units or something like that?
We exercise the pre-order model to a lot of degrees. So there's a lot of things you just don't know about audiences too, and there needs to be some bit of discovery there. Sometimes you can make bets and know that you have an audience baked in. Through history, we've collected a lot of data on sales that. Not personal data. I just mean like we can look at historic sales and identify like what might do well, what might not do well. But the thing that we decided as a business, Amanda and I, years ago, was we were not going to carry an excessive amount of inventory, because what can happen is, and this is the secret that no one really discusses when you're really thinking about making a product in mass, is inventory is a tax liability. Inventory is like cash that's not cash, and it becomes an exposure in and of itself. So it's really important not to carry that much inventory, and it's better to replenish than it is to just have a stockpile of things. And so therefore you just have to look at things a little differently, and you have to look at things from lower quantities. Even though it's cheaper to produce 50,000 of something, it's much smarter to produce a couple thousand of something, and then produce a couple thousand more of something, and produce a couple thousand more of something in success and demand. Otherwise, you lose your shirt, and you take a bath, and you can lose your business ultimately if you overproduce stuff. And we've seen indie developers that produce their own merchandise make those mistakes, because you get suckered in by manufacturers to be like, oh, well, if you add a couple thousand more, we can shave off $1 or $2. But it's like, at the end of the day, like, what is that $1 or $2 worth to you if you're sitting on thousands of extra units you can't sell, versus like spending a couple extra bucks but selling through the whole inventory? From our perspective, it's much better to sell out of something and then bring it back by popular demand than it is to just infinitely make something available because you just wanted to get a really good deal. Yeah. You might
end up having to bury some stuff in the desert if you.
I mean, ET is the choice example of just getting in over your head. Like thinking you have a crystal ball to tell you what the future looks like in terms of success and sales. And the fact of the matter is, no one can predict the future of anything selling. You can do your best in an educated way to say like, hey, we can look at the historics of what we did here. We can draw comps on certain titles. This game is like this game. But the reality is, like, it's zeitgeist, it's human attraction and instinct and opinion, and anything could happen in the world at any moment. We had a global pandemic start last year, or not last year, but a year and a half ago, that spawned into this thing that could have taken down the entire retail industry and dramatically shifted how people, buy things and interact with stuff. And it did. But it didn't take it down. It just adjusted perspective. And, like, we have a very lovely business advisor. His name is Norm. And he years ago said, anything could happen. Like, literally anything could happen. So, like, just don't take it for granted, and, like, plan for the future, but also, look at the now. And, he was right. And that's what we're always trying to do, is like, we're trying to think ahead, but we're also giving ourselves enough pivot point that we can react when things are important. You don't want to get too far ahead because then, things can occur that you can't shift.
No. Well, I'm very conscious of the time now. But I'll ask you two quick questions then to round up. The first one is, what does the future hold for all of this? Which is a really horrible, quick question. It's a huge question. But what's the future hold for physical product in your view, based on your experience?
We think it's super bright. Like the future for physical goods it is akin to something I said earlier, where people, when they go to a concert or travel to a foreign country or go to a theme park, and they have a wonderful experience, the human compulsion is to acquire an artifact that reminds you of that thing, to basically put that memory into a physical, tangible object. That's what's happening with games. And you've seen that trajectory for the last few years now, where merchandise and the proliferation of things related to any particular game that you might like is because people are visiting worlds. They're being introduced to characters and exploring narratives and getting emotionally attached. And when you're emotionally attached to something, you want to collect that thing. You want a memento. You want to, much like you go to France, you might buy a refrigerator magnet to remind you of the Eiffel Tower. Same thing is true of going to Hyrule, or going to visit Sonic the Hedgehog or hanging out with Donkey Kong, like what Ori in the Blind Forest and Ori in the Will of the Wisps. It's a magical forest in which you meet these animal friends, which sounds silly when I say it like that, but you spend 12, 20 hours in this world and you experience life and death and chaos and thrills and you get that whole swirl and you come out of it and you're like, all of a sudden that theme song, that music has much more significance to you than, it did going into the first hour. And, there's artifacts, there's symbols, there's an interior language that is meaningful to you. And that's true for most games. So, physical merchandise is about the emotional connection more than anything else. And if games continue to provoke and instill that kind of experience, and games are only getting better at it, you're just going to see more and more stuff that people want as a result of that. And I think it's important to attach that to, like, you don't just want to make merch to make merch. You want to make merch that actually feels like you're bottling up some of that emotion and reminding people of those experiences. And that's the powerful stuff.
That's brilliant. Do apologize. My kid's toy is just playing by itself in the corner of the room. So I don't know if you could hear any of that, but I can't,
but very haunting.
Yeah, I'm a little disturbed. It's doing it again. There's you're branching out into new. I'm asked a final question. You're branching out into new areas such as publishing. How is that all going?
For us, it's going great. First of all, and for us, it wasn't something that we initially thought we wanted to do, and we've been talking about it for years. And when Amanda and I got into these discussions, or friends would ask why, or business colleagues, partners would ask, like, "Oh, why doesn't I 8-Bit publish games?" We just didn't really understand, like, what our POV was, like, what is our perspective on it. There's a lot of other people that we work with and partner with that do it really well, and they all have a perspective. And we didn't want to just replicate someone else's point of view. Like, we wanted to have our own. And suddenly it all kind of clicked in the last year or so. And Ori and the Will of the Wisps was, the first time it was like, oh, wow, we have an opportunity to do special things if we can kind of congeal all of these things together and create a relationship between digital and physical and bridge that gap. And what we started to realize was it was taking people's relationship with digital things and manifesting them into physical ways that when you can dance with the whole ecosystem and it's not like fragmented or separated, the opportunities are much more vast, and you can think about them much farther in advance. So what games we're publishing in the future are all kind of related to that experience, like the experience humans have together in spaces, doing things, interacting with things, transferring those experiences into the digital landscape, and then pulling them back out into the physical landscape and creating this kind of beautiful cadence and relationship. That sounds really abstract, but at the end of the day, that's the kind of stuff that makes us happy. And it's an experience that's unique to us because we produce events. We appreciate the tactile and tangible, and in the chaos of the pandemic, that whole business line was stripped from us, not just from a financial sense, but from a human experience and satisfaction sense. And so we started really thinking deeply about how do we bring that back into people's lives when they can't have those things tangibly. And so that's the kind of stuff we're coming out with in the next couple of years. And we're really excited about it.
I'm excited to hear about it. But I'll have to stop it there before the toy starts singing again. I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you so much, Jon. Thank you. It's been a pleasure having you on at GI Live Online. And if you want to hear more from Jon, I'm sure he'll be around the event as well. So do say hello. That is actually our last talk for today. If you're in the Discord, games legend Warren Spector is about to show up and say hello. So do have a chat with him. Do stick around. Tomorrow, though, we've got loads and loads of stuff going on. We've got Peter Moore Veland Studios Guhar Bala, the Human Fall Flat team. We've got quite a few top people coming along. And then we end with the Indie Publishing Awards. Plus, we've got more industry legends in the Discord, including Team 17 CEO Debbie Beswick and Doom designer John Romero. So they'll be there as well. So do come back for that too. Until tomorrow, though, have a fabulous evening. Have a fabulous day. Thank you very much.